Welcome, everyone. I want to let you know you're in the right spot with Operation Parent and Dr. Weiner. We're so thankful that you've chose to join us this afternoon. I'm going to tell you about a couple of the logistics of participating with us today. You're going to receive a recording of the webinar, certificate of attendance this evening, and then you're also going to get a link to the survey immediately following this webinar. And our audience has been so generous to us in the past, and I know you continue to be, to help us build this webinar program and make it exactly what you're needing in today's culture. So just take a couple minutes following the close of the webinar today and give us some feedback on what you thought about today's program and what you'd like us to do next. We have a couple handouts for you that I just want to let you know. We've got a good lineup of handouts for you. We've got from the Reach Lab out of Stanford, quitting tips of tobacco and cannabis, and that is available in Spanish. We also have some information about the upcoming Stanford Reach Lab Cannabis Conference that we're going to talk to you a little bit more about. And then you have a copy of today's slide deck, so you can follow around with us. You can follow with us or check that out later. Here at Operation Parent, we are a nonprofit, and it's our mission to love and support parents by providing real-world information, connection, and most importantly, my favorite part of our mission is hope. Today's title is Vaping in 2025, What's Changed and What Parents Need to Know with Dr. Aaron Weiner. We've got some upcoming webinars, an action-packed schedule that we hope you will register for. You are able to do the pop-up and register for all three of these webinars at once if you would like. We're going to dig into marijuana on March the 4th. We are partnering with the College Doc, Dr. Jill Grimes, on April the 8th to talk about launching your high schoolers and helping them fly the nest and taking charge of their health. On May the 6th, we are talking about parenting in an addictive world and how to step in when your kids need you and how to help as well. So I hope you'll continue to join us for those upcoming webinars. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Weiner. Many of you, if you've been with us before, have seen his past webinars. He is a board certified counseling psychologist. He's the owner of Bridge Forward Counseling. His newest role includes serving as the executive consultant for the Prevention Reach Institute. He is a valued partner of Operation Parent, and he is, as I mentioned, co-hosted several of our past webinars. He is a trailblazer in the prevention field, and that's what we absolutely love about him most. He speaks nationally on topics like opioid addiction, marijuana, commercialization of marijuana, and the vaping epidemic is one of his biggest passions. He's often tapped as a context expert for both policymaking and media outlets. Dr. Weiner is an outspoken advocate for prevention on his podcast, Let's Talk with Dr. Aaron Weiner, and on his LinkedIn platform, where I get the opportunity to interact with him the most and would encourage you to do so as well. He's publishing some current studies and great information there on LinkedIn, and that's just a great place to follow him. So welcome, Dr. Weiner. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who's taking some time out of your day today to be here and to talk a little bit about vaping and what's new. And if you've come to a webinar that I've done with Operation Parent before, and I've done a couple, they're a fantastic organization. You're in a great place. Hopefully today you'll come across some things that are new. That was what the title is really all about. You know, vaping is something that changes quite often. And so what we're going to talk about today are how things have changed over the past decade. And that's the first thing, how it's developed, how vaping and nicotine are harmful to health, and particularly to teen health. And we've got some new research and data that we're going to talk about there as well. And third, how parents can prepare and support teens to navigate challenging conversations and situations, because it can be tough to know how to talk about it. But ultimately, knowledge is important, but knowing what to do with the knowledge, in my opinion, is even more important. Because that's really where the rubber meets the road. We want to help our kids. So hopefully by the time we're done today, we'll have accomplished those 3 things. If you have questions, please do throw those into the Q&A. We'll have some time at the end, a good solid chunk of time really to answer them. And we'll hopefully get everybody taken care of. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. I want to start just with a very basic, broad overview of what's going on statistically, because actually there's some aspects of this that are still not so good, but then there's other aspects of this that are moving in the right direction. So the most recent data we have is from the National Youth Tobacco Survey in 2024, where actually, so the good news is that this number is actually less than it was in 2023, but we still do have 1.6 million teens who are vaping in 2024. The most common brand right now is still Elf Bar, and Elf Bar right now is called BC 5000. It's a little bit, they've rebranded. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the brands tend to shift, but generally speaking, we're finding them still centering on disposables, and more on the implications on that in a minute. A lot of kids who vape use them daily, and this part is really critical. Most of them are doing it for the flavors, which kind of makes intuitive sense, right? Like why would they be doing it? Well, one part of it is nicotine, and nicotine is addictive, but the other part is that it's pleasurable to use them and they taste good. And this is a tactic that's been used for a very long time to bring kids into nicotine use and then keep them there. Now, while we are seeing a positive trend in the high school demographic, we're seeing the opposite if we get a little bit older and we look at what young adults are doing. So this is the Monitoring the Future data, again, the most recent that we have. And you can see here how the 30-day vaping trends for ages 19 through 30 is continually going up and up and up. So, time will still tell whether or not this trend will then soak back down younger again, whether or not we'll start to see this level off, or whether it seems now that the escalation is just happening a little bit later, like when folks get out to college rather than in high school. But definitely not an issue that's resolved, which is, I assume, why most of us are here today. Is it something that's we've heard about either from our own kids or that you're aware of is going on in their environment? Now, we'll talk about health today, for sure. We'll talk about flavors, but ultimately a big through line through all of this, and I speak on this topic a lot, is that this is a business and that the people who make vapes are in it to make money. And generally speaking, when you're in the business of selling addictive products, you usually aim young. One part of the reason for that is that means that if you get somebody hooked, they tend to stick with you for a while. But the other is that actually youth's brains are more susceptible to falling into addiction. If you look at any substance and the rate at which if someone is under, say, the age of certainly 20, but even 25 in some cases, versus over, and how likely it is that they're going to get addicted when they use it, it is more likely when you're younger. And so we see things like New York Times articles about how vapes get a Gen Z makeover because, well, what kids are into these days is a bit different than what they were into before. And so these companies are pivoting to make sure that they are still appealing to young people. And we'll talk more about how in just a second. But first, let's define what vapes are. What they are is they're what's called a nicotine delivery system. You use them to heat any substance. In this case, we're talking about a nicotine liquid, but that creates a vapor to release the chemical. Anytime you're trying to get a chemical out of something else, you have to release it somehow. So one way to do that, you can eat it, and then your stomach, you digest it, go through your digestive tract, absorb it that way. Classically, nicotine is delivered through burning, so combustion. You light it on fire, the combustion releases the chemical. Problem, of course, with that is that it creates a bunch of toxic chemicals and tar, which goes into your lungs. And so the original pitch was saying, well, hey, what if we found a way to get the nicotine out of tobacco without having to light it on fire? And maybe that would be not as bad as lighting it on fire. And, spoiler alert, that is true, actually. It is not as bad. But the thing is that actually, if you were previously just breathing air and no chemicals and no nicotine, and now you are breathing chemicals and nicotine, you are a lot worse off than when you started. We'll talk more about it specifically how that is in just a little bit. Now, vapes come in a few different form factors. The original versions, if you will, what really caught on were the pod-based models, most specifically Juul. And Juul was really, the 800-pound gorilla in the vape world for a while until they kind of got selectively hit by a flavor ban at which their company crashed. And part of the reason for that is a huge portion of the vaping market is driven by teenagers. And so if teenagers only care about flavors, and now you can't do flavors, they're going to migrate to something else, which is exactly what they did. Some of them went to what these are called, these tank-based models called mods, where you refill the liquid over and over and over again. They tend to be a little bit more expensive, but have more features to them. But by and large, what kids are using are disposable vapes, where they have up to a very large amount actually of nicotine inside compared to cigarettes. Some of them actually can hold 100 packs worth of nicotine inside of them, but they tend to be very inexpensive, like maybe $20 or less. And then when you're done, you just throw them out. Despite the fact, by the way, that they do have a lithium-ion battery in them, which is terrible for the environment. But most people don't recycle their vapes. Most of the time, they just pitch them. Now, I mentioned there was this selective flavor ban, where it really just got mostly at the pod-based systems. And so kids moved over, and right now, this is what, so what Elf Bar used to be is what BC 5000 is now. It's literally the same form factor. It's what you saw pictured in that New York Times headline, that picture that was with the headline a minute ago, where you can get blue raz and triple berry ice. And anytime you see ice in the name of a vape, that means it has some sort of menthol or mint combined with the candy. And the reason for that is that for same reason why you might put menthol in a cigarette, is that it creates a cooling sensation rather than a burning one when you use it. And that ultimately, the sensation and the experience of vaping is something that makes it very hard to quit, and something a parent called an exquisite prison in a really great docuseries on Netflix. I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in the topic of vaping. It's called Big Vape: The Rise and Fall of Juul. But there's a parent in there who was talking about her son had started vaping. And she was recognizing, like, man, like with cigarettes, at least they taste terrible. But with vapes, you have a product that's actually stronger than cigarettes in terms of nicotine, that's easier to use. You could take it to bed. You can use it inside the house. There's so many more places where you can use it. But then it's also flavored in fruity and sweet ways. And actually, that's what surveys say of kids when you ask them what do they like the most. It's mostly fruit. That's the why the bars stretch furthest to the right here, followed by menthol and mint, followed by your dessert, and then lastly, that one there at the bottom is the other, which is kind of code for nicotine, or rather for tobacco. So what smokers who are trying to not smoke anymore could theoretically tolerate the best is what kids actually like the least. And so if this was a product that was aimed at adults, it would probably look a bit different, and also maybe be, say, like if it was meant as a harm reduction device, maybe it would be like, say, behind the pharmacy counter, something like that. We see a little bit of a different delivery method here. But where we are right now is we're at something where it is very strong. It does taste really nice, and there's no off-ramp. That was the other element from that interview in the docuseries that I thought was so fascinating to think about, was that the original pitch, again, was to get people off of smoking and onto vaping. But what happens after they get there, right? And it's like saying, well, so this is better, but then what? There's no off-ramp. And in many ways, vaping has a lot more of the positive reinforcing elements of using nicotine with the flavors and all of that than smoking does. And it's stronger. So how are we going to get them off? And I would argue that the people who made it didn't necessarily care about that so much. They felt justified in where they were. Maybe people would be better off. Problem is, though, right? If most people who use your product are teenagers, they're not going from smoking to vaping, they're going from nothing to vaping, and that's very, very different. So why it's different is that vaping is actively harmful to your health, and we'll talk about why here. So first off, it is addictive because that's contained in the vast majority of vapes. So we have evidence to show that nicotine in vapes also addictive. There are, however, numerous toxic substances in there other than nicotine, as well as heavy metals, and that there's a heterogeneity to it. There's different components, different versions, different liquids have different numbers of toxins because there's no regulation on this. We also know that vaping aerosol causes DNA mutagenesis, which is the thing that causes cancer. So while we don't have those really long-term studies that show that vaping causes cancer, vaping does cause the thing that causes cancer. So give it a little more time and we'll get there. Now, what's actually in there? Again, bunches and bunches of chemicals. Here's just a few of them that I have listed here on this slide. Where do they come from, though? This is a question I get a lot when I talk with students, when I talk with parents. How are they there, particularly for kids? If they're actually buying the vapes, they'll say like, well, so it doesn't say that there's formaldehyde on the box, so how's it in there? Where's it coming from? Well, the answer is twofold. The first part of this is that because these are not regulated products, anything could be in there and we wouldn't know. These are produced largely in China, shipped over here. There's no oversight. So who knows what's actually in there? If it's what they say it is, if there's contaminants, we don't know. But for formaldehyde in particular, where that comes from is something called pyrolysis, or thermal degradation of the components that are in the vape. The way this works is whenever you superheat a substance, it degrades into a bunch of other chemicals under that heat. That's what pyrolysis means. It degrades under heat. And so formaldehyde, which is, of course, it's cancer-causing, famously in cigarettes, also the embalming fluid that the frogs are preserved in before you dissect them in high school. Where that comes from is that the liquid base in any vape, essentially, is a combination of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, or PG and VG for short. If you see that abbreviation, PG, VG, if you're seeing that, say, like on your child's texts or something, that's referring to vape liquid. But propylene glycol, PG, is in almost every vape and it breaks down under heat into formaldehyde. And so that's where the formaldehyde comes from. And there was a study that came out that found that there's actually between 1,000 and 2,000 different chemicals in vapes, depending on the brand. Now let's talk for a second about the metals. So you can see over here, we've got like lead, nickel, so on and so forth. This can come from a number of places. Again, no regulation on the liquid, but the other part of it is that the heating coils can degrade. So as the coils are used, what superheats that liquid to be inhaled, if they flake, if something comes off of them, that then can be inhaled into the lungs. There was actually a study that came out in tobacco control last year that was looking at this. They just looked for 3 metals in particular. They were looking for cadmium, lead, and uranium, and they did find that in kids who vaped more, we saw these elevated levels of lead, elevated levels of uranium. And they concluded that vaping in early life could probably increase the risk of exposure to these chemicals. It seems to be associated with the amount that you vape. They didn't actually find cadmium in this particular study. But lead and uranium are not things that are ideal to put in your body because they can actually do some pretty rough things to you. This next slide, I'm not going to read the whole thing off to you. You are provided with these slides, so this is more of a reference source. But there was a review that came out in 2022 that looked at all of the different compounds and metals that we know are in vapes, and then what we know those compounds do to the human body. So here's lead, for example. We know that lead causes hypertension, renal, that's the kidney damage, and central nervous system damage. But they really go through a lot of different compounds. Like here's formaldehyde, carcinogen, bronchitis, pneumonia. There's a very long list of issues that these chemicals that are in vapes can do to you. So this is, again, because vaping in the grand scheme of things is relatively new, we don't have really long-term data on it yet. And so we do know though what's in it, and we do know what those component parts can do to you. And so right now we have reviews like this. Given a little bit more time, we'll see more of those direct links between vaping and a lot of these things in all likelihood. For now, though, we do know that these things are in there, and they're actively harmful to human growth, development, and just health in general, even if you're an adult. Now, some people, particularly these days, are asking, well, what about nicotine alone? Because nicotine is something that can be put into the body in ways other than vaping or smoking, more specifically in like these Zyn pouches, which are starting to catch on as well. So if you haven't heard of these, we'll call it if vaping is like the newer version of smoking, nicotine pouches are like the newer version of chewing tobacco, where you take the pouch, you slip it between your gum and your lip, and it leaches out the nicotine and then flavoring over time. The thing is, though, that nicotine alone disrupts brain development, particularly in the serotonergic system and the limbic system. The limbic system in the brain is what's associated with urges and impulses and emotions. Serotonin, I like to think of it as it's kind of like emotional lubricant. So if you're, say, have like a lot of serotonin, sometimes that makes it easier to modulate your mood. That's why a lot of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs involve that. But it disrupts the ability for adolescents' brains to develop properly in that way. And that's because our brains aren't done developing until we're about 25. I think there's like, I know I learned when I was younger, they were like, oh, you get every brain cell you're going to get when you're born, and then after that, you just lose them depending on what you do. That's not exactly how it works. There's a lot of development, growth, pruning in some cases that occurs all the way up until about age 25. And so generally speaking, you want to try to keep the brain as natural as possible up until that point, because we have evidence that shows that really any psychoactive substances have the propensity to start shifting and changing some things. And nicotine certainly is no different. What we see when nicotine alone, just nicotine is exposed, an adolescent brain is exposed to nicotine, are things like reduced attention span, increased impulsivity, enhanced anxiety and fear responses, depressive symptoms in adulthood, and that it's correlated with them being more likely to use other drugs. Actually, nicotine and THC are interesting in that they are the two drugs we found that tend to prime the brain to have more positive experiences with other drugs, which is also part of why they're oftentimes correlated with other substance use. It's also related with high-risk sexual behavior and then psychiatric disorder development. Now, nicotine itself is very difficult to quit just in and of itself. When you look at the number of people who want to quit each year, which tends to be most people, and this is for smoking. Again, we don't have data for vaping quite yet on many of these variables, but we will. But a lot of people want to stop, but very few make it. The quit rate is highest actually amongst young people, but it's still about 10%. It's under 10% some years. And it just goes downhill from there. And about 40%, 39% of smokers are never able to quit. And if you are smoking at the time of your death, there's a 2/3 chance that that is what killed you. And so we don't have these metrics for vaping yet. And certainly there are some reduced risks to vaping versus smoking, like say, for example, no tar. There's 1,000 to 2,000 chemicals in vape aerosols, because that's what you breathe in. It's not actually vapor, right? It's not like water vapor. It's a chemical mist, so it's an aerosol. There are fewer chemicals in vape aerosols than there are in cigarettes, but again, 1 to 2,000 is a lot more than zero. So we've just got to give it a little bit more time. So then the question is, so then like what's keeping us here? If we know that this is harmful and we know that bunches of kids are using these products and continue to use their products, and they're designed like exquisite prisons with these flavors and high potencies and all that, why haven't we changed things? The answer, like so many things that happen in this world and with politics, is money. A lot of money, particularly to be made from selling vapes to young people and making them cool and appealing. Because again, the vast majority of people who develop an addiction in their life to anything actually are under the age of 20. If you make it, what the statistics tell us, if you make it over the age of 20 and you have not developed an addiction to anything, there's about a 90% chance you're not going to develop an addiction to anything, statistically speaking. Of course, it's possible. We're all biologically similar to the point where if we use a substance enough, we can develop a chemical dependency to it. But generally speaking, if we get someone out of their teenage years and they haven't gotten addicted to something, they probably won't. But if you're trying to sell these things, that means that kids are your market, which is why nowadays, like what we're seeing is this, when we talk about exquisite prisons, right? So this is a vape that has integrated video games into it. You can see here, this has got 20,000 puffs in it and all of these different flavors, like berry and berry again and strawberry. And I mean, there's all sorts of different flavors. They've got Tetris, they've got Pac-Man, they've got Space Invaders that's built into the devices. This has been out for a while. There's another one though. I just became aware of these a few months ago, and they are still being sold. Talk about like, man, like I wish we can have faster regulation on things. You now can buy for about $20 a virtual pet vape where, and I swear I'm not making this up. So you've got this virtual pet. To earn coins to feed it so it doesn't die, you have to take hits on the vape. So every time you take a hit, you earn money. If you don't continue to vape, your Tamagotchi will die, which is like the most sadistic thing I could possibly imagine. What they also did, though, for this particular one, they've included a slot machine simulator in there, not for real money, but let's get kids accustomed to gambling. But then they also have a puff count competition, because a lot of these devices now you can actually pair them with your phone, but where you can compete with your friends to see who can vape the most in any given week. So yeah, like I think we're kind of a long way from tobacco cessation, right? Like you really can't look at this and make any compelling argument that this is for like a 55-year-old chain smoker. And ultimately, part of why it's so great that everyone's here today is that we can't really count necessarily on broad regulatory or enforcement action, because actually all of these things are illegal, technically speaking. It's just the enforcement of that illegality is very slow right now. It's been slow. It will probably continue to be slow. And so these companies just push and push and push as hard as they can. What that means, though, is that it's incumbent on us as parents and adults to prepare our kids for this landscape so that they know what they're looking at and they understand what's really going on here, right? It's not just like, oh, it was vaping and it's like water vapor and there's 5 ingredients and it's not harmful to your health in any way and you get to grow a little virtual dog. Like that's really not what this is. But even if, say, for example, the FDA came in and said, all right, you can't sell these Tamagotchi vapes anymore, it doesn't necessarily stick so well. Let me give you an example. So prior to where we are right now, one of the biggest brands in disposable vapes after Juul went down because of that selective ban was Puff Bar. And they were king of the hill. They were selling a bunch. But then because they got very big, there was a crackdown from the FDA. They said, Puff Bar, we need you to come off the market. And so for a hot minute, they were. But then probably like maybe 4 or 5 months later, they came back and they were the first ones that I saw to do this. Their site was back up, looked exactly like it did before, except now they have tobacco-free nicotine. So previously, FDA could only regulate tobacco. They couldn't regulate nicotine. That was actually the case up until, I believe, 2019. And so Puff Bar just said, okay, well, we're not a tobacco product anymore. We're a nicotine product, so you can't stop us. And I think that went on for like about another 2 years. So that's what this looks like. And so again, it's so important right now that kids understand what they're looking at and that parents understand what's out there, because that, even just the corporate malfeasance, let's just say, aside, the products are changing and they're growing, and they're growing more strong. They're growing stronger. That's what we're looking at in this slide. So this was again, in tobacco control. I think about a year back, they were looking at the changes in vapes between 2017 and 2022. And what they found is that the potency in vapes have increased by about 3 times as much. The capacity has gone up by 5 times as much in some cases. And again, there are some vapes that quite literally have the same amount, like a disposable vape you can hold in your hand. It has the same amount of nicotine as 100 packs of cigarettes. And the price rather has gone down by 70% over those 5 years. So vapes are bigger and cheaper than they used to be. And that was, again, that study ended in 2022. I shudder to think where we've gotten to in the meantime. I pretty much guarantee you it hasn't gone back in the other direction, because that's not the way that this field was going. Now, where it definitely is going, though, again, is towards these nicotine pouches, right? And you can kind of already see these trends starting to emerge, right? This idea of, well, so you don't want to be putting chemicals in your lungs. This doesn't put chemicals in your lungs. So you don't, there's going to be these pitches, and we're already seeing the social media influencers, for example, that are popping up. Philip Morris, the tobacco company that creates Zyn, actually is building a $600 million production facility in Colorado, literally as we speak, to create more of these. So as much as this is already around, I think after we see this plant, I think there's one other that they're building as well come online. They're certainly going to have competitors. You can see where this is going. So this is a little bit of a portal vision into our future, probably, shoot out next 2 to 5 years. But this is always changing. And that brings me into the next section of the presentation, which is, well, what can we do? So that's what the landscape looks like now for vaping in 2025. But as parents, as I think there's folks here today from health departments, from schools, who care a lot about this, what can we do? How do we understand what's going on, not just in the industry and with the products, but in the kids and with the kids that leads them to where they are, and how can we impact them to help them navigate through this landscape that is constantly changing and developing. So step one is we do need to understand the why. Why are they doing this? Because an axiom I use a lot in my clinical work is that behavior is always purpose driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense. So what I mean by that is, like, look, say for example, at a kid who's vaping, and maybe has continued to vape even though it's causing them problems at school or at home or in whatever context. And you're like, why are they doing this? Like, it's bad for their health. Maybe I've given them information about nicotine in the brain that I got from this webinar today. Like, why do they continue to do it? There is an answer to that question. And the thing about it is that oftentimes when people act in ways that don't make sense, and this isn't just for kids, this goes for adults as well. Oftentimes when people act in ways that don't seem to make sense, the reason why is emotional. Because we are very emotionally driven organisms, creatures. We care a lot about feelings, and when we don't have our emotions met, we do things that don't seem to make sense in order to feel better. So if you think about mood being on a continuum from very positive, very negative, when things start getting really negative, like not just that you're irritated, but you're furious, not just that you're feeling clinical depression or chronic anxiety, panic attacks, that's when we start to do things to try to feel better. That's when we start to develop nervous tics or engage in addictive behaviors, have eating disorders, maybe to feel more in some cases, snapping at others if we're angry, saying things that are hurtful, even though we might love somebody, because we're feeling a lot of tension inside where we don't want that discomfort anymore. And so ultimately, if we take a step back and say, all right, so if unhealthy coping, like using vapes, comes from discomfort, well, that must mean that kids are pretty uncomfortable. And that is unfortunately what we're seeing. We can talk about this sliced in a few different ways, but I'm just going to show one piece of data here that I think is just very stark and affecting. And this is from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the most recent one that came out last year, looking at 2023 data. This table is looking at depressive symptoms and suicidal symptoms as well. And what they found was that in 2023, 40% of kids said that they had experienced clinical depression. 1 in 5 kids seriously considered attempting suicide. 1 in 10 actually tried it. 1 in 10 kids in 2023 attempted suicide. And that honestly hasn't changed that much. The depression's been going up, but the suicide rate's been around 10 for a while now. And so that's a lot. Right? Like if you're like in a school setting and you have a classroom of 30 kids, and statistically speaking, that means that 6 of them really seriously thought about suicide and 3 of them tried to kill themselves last year. There's a tremendous burden, a tremendous amount of pain right now. And when you ask kids, what are the reasons why you use substances the most? They tend to say 3 things. One has to do with internal emotional factors. So things like depression, if they've gone through or are going through adverse childhood events, some traumatic stress, destabilization in the home, that sort of thing. But they're carrying a burden on the inside that they just want to try to escape from. The second are stressors on the outside. School, it's tremendous. There's a tremendous amount of pressure right now from school, the world at large. There's a lot of unrest right now that kids are soaking up, and they're feeling that. The third is social, and this is something that is very it's front of mind for kids in a way. For adults, not necessarily quite as much, because at this stage of life, kids are oftentimes trying to figure out who they are, who they fit with, who they want to be, how they want to be. And what that means is that if you've been hanging out with a group of people for a long time and now all of a sudden they're vaping and you don't want to, that kind of puts you on the outside looking in. That doesn't feel very good. Or if you want to be part of a group and they're all vaping and you're not, well, that puts you on the outside, and it's very, very hard to make that connection. So the social side, it's a huge component of this. I heard a theory, I'm not sure where it originated, but it's a very interesting one, about substance use, that in many ways it is a social contagion, kind of like a virus, and that you don't come across like a vape tree in the wild. Like you just like walk out and you find like a blueberry vape bush and you pick one of the vapes off and you try it. And you're like, ooh, I'm going to keep coming back to this bush where I just found a vape. It's passed down socially. It's not something that's inherent. It's given to you because you're either seeing it in media or someone's modeling it for you or someone literally offers it to you in a social setting. It's not something that develops on its own. It's something provided to you by society. And so the social influences in particular are very strong for young people. Ultimately, though, what I want to land on is to think about quote unquote bad behavior. And we could stick vaping in a little bit differently, and that you can think of behaviors as being the tip of the iceberg. That's what you see. You might see your child vaping. You might see your child crying or acting aggressively, whatever it is. Ultimately, though, that's being informed by some underlying stressor or need that they're trying to meet. It's probably very understandable. Maybe they're feeling lonely. Maybe they're feeling stressed. Maybe they're feeling depressed. It's the strategy that they're using to accomplish that emotional goal that's not working so well for them. The underlying need is very understandable. And so focusing on the why, not the what, is really important when thinking about how do we address vaping. Because largely, whether or not we're talking about an individual kid or whether or not we're talking about a trend at a school, this is an emotional and, in my opinion, cultural phenomena. There's a reason why they're vaping and not smoking. Right? Some of it has to do with the experience of doing it, but a lot of it has to do with the cultural side of it, how they identify what they're trying to meet. And so getting at the why. Why are they doing it? What's the emotional need? How do I meet that in a different way is going to be really, really key to what can parents do. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what parents can do. I also have a couple thoughts about what communities can do and what schools can do as well. So the first thing, though, for caregivers that you can do is stay connected to your child and know the signs of use. So this first part here about staying connected, I don't have like a separate slide on this, but I just want to say this is not a throwaway phrase. It's so important to know what your child is doing, because if you don't know what normal is, you're not going to know when it changes. So make sure that you stay connected. You have an idea of what's going on with them. Now, in terms of signs of adolescent substance use, you might see a number of different things shift. You might see changes in school functioning, for example, where they're not doing quite as well in homework, have fewer extracurriculars. You might see their peer group start to shift, particularly if their peers aren't the ones who are the ones vaping. So maybe like the old friends have faded away, they've got new friends, but you haven't met them. Maybe there's a reason for that. On social media, what are they following? What are they posting? You'd be very surprised actually at how much drug use and drug behavior is just right out there in the open on social media if you take the time to look. And it's so important for this and many other reasons. It's so important to monitor your kids in their tech and online and social media life, because there's a lot of pitfalls there that can cause a tremendous amount of harm. So making sure you stay up on that. On the family dynamics side, you might see things like your relationship getting a bit strained because perhaps they know something, they know they're doing something that you wouldn't approve of, and they don't necessarily want to talk to you about it. That creates some tension. They might be avoiding you, be more moody. They might break curfew, those sorts of things. You may also start to see changes in personal appearance and habits, things like decline in hygiene, burns on fingers or lips. This would be less with vaping in this next one as well, maybe more on the THC side of things. Those, though, however, can be put in vapes as well. The THC concentrate, so something to be aware of there. Long sleeves in warm weather can hide vapes up them. And then just clothing in general. A lot of times kids will use their appearance or sometimes their appearance in online places as a really important form of self-expression for them. And so if it seems like they're changing their vibe and how they look in a way that's identifying with a particular subculture, that's definitely something to pay attention to. If a child either has too much or too little money, that can be a sign either that they are buying substances at school or reselling them. And that's very common actually in terms of how these get into schools. It's so easy to get vapes, right? Access always drives use. And so it's possible just to have someone over 21 go buy vapes, and then kind of like small time drug dealers, someone younger than buys them and takes them into school and sells them at an upcharge. If there's a lot of secretive phone calls, changes in sleep habits or energy, asking to go to the bathroom a lot, having munchies or sudden appetite, all of these can be related to substance use. Munchies, sudden appetite in particular, of course, that's with THC. Unusual scents, overuse of scents can be trying to cover things up. If you do, so vapes do have a smell though. So like if you smell something that's like seems like strongly sweet or strongly fruity in the air, and you're like, oh, that probably is the aerosol from a vape that will dissipate in a way that some cigarette smoke doesn't. But soon after vaping, you absolutely still can. So the second thing is you've got to make sure that you are safe to talk to. Including and particularly difficulties and failures. And this is so important because if your child doesn't think that you're emotionally safe to talk to, they aren't going to talk to you in all likelihood, because they just simply think that they're going to be worse off for it. And so in order to create that sense of emotional safety, you have to show it over time. And that's the thing about emotions. Like if you want someone to feel differently about you, they have to experience you in a certain way. Like, for example, for those who have never met me before, haven't come to one of my webinars before or a talk, when I first started talking to you, you'd be like, well, who's this guy? Like, why should I believe what he has to say? Like maybe he's on my screen, but that doesn't necessarily matter. I just happen to be on here. Well, hopefully over the course of the last 40 minutes or so, I've given you information. You're like, oh, this seems pretty valid. Maybe this is worth listening to. Maybe now you trust me in what I'm presenting more than you did 40 minutes ago. That's because, again, hopefully, I demonstrated credibility to you. The same thing works for emotional safety. If you just tell someone, hey, you can trust me, they're not going to trust you, right? Why would they? That's a feeling. You impact feelings through experiences. And so the way that you create experience of emotional safety is through communicating with love, which was a great acronym that was created by the Center for Motion and Change, which stands for listen, offer, validate, and empathize. We're going to take a minute on this slide because if I had to pick one to-do idea that's maybe more important than just about anything else, it's having an emotionally safe and open relationship with your child. And if you don't know what those ingredients look like, this can be very helpful. So let's start with listening. Listening means active listening. So what active listening means is not just how you hold yourself, but this is a good example of that, right? You can see some good eye contact there, leaning in, that sort of thing, but also showing with your verbalizations that you're listening to somebody. And two ways you can do that really easily are with things called open-ended questions and with reflections. So an open-ended question is a question that doesn't have a quick yes or no or like one word answer. So it's the difference between saying, did you have a good day at school today? Yeah. Versus, what was the most interesting thing that you learned at school today? Or what's something at school that's really like challenging and tough right now? That creates more options to share details, which shows that you care about the details of somebody's life, particularly if you then show that you're listening to those details and responding to them. And the way that you do that is through reflections. A reflection is simply reflecting something back to someone, either the content or their emotions in different words than they said them in. So you're not just parroting it back to them, but you're taking in the information and then showing that you understood them because what you return back is a little bit different. So if you say, if your son or daughter is talking to you about how they just really struggled on a history test, and they've got like a furrowed brow and they sound a little bit terse, if you're listening and you say, oh man, that sounds so frustrating. Like I know you worked so hard on that, and to not get that grade, that must feel terrible. That's a reflection, right? That's taking in the meaning, taking in the emotions and returning them in different words. That shows someone that they've been heard, and that usually feels really, really good to someone. So that's the first part, active listening. The second is, how do you offer advice and guidance? And this is really important, particularly around the subject with vaping, because a lot of parents might have a lot of strong opinions about how their son or daughter should not vape. And you might even be right about that because it is actively harmful to your son or daughter's health. But if you come at it giving unsolicited advice or strong-arming or shoving ideas down their throat, they're much less likely to actually take your advice than if you instead offer what's called a feedback sandwich. And so what this means is that when you offer advice or feedback, instead of just giving it, you take that advice and you sandwich it inside two opportunities for autonomy. So the first opportunity is by asking permission to share the advice in the first place. So literally saying, hey, like I have an idea that might help. Do you mind if I share it with you? And hopefully they'll be like, yeah, go right ahead. If they don't, by the way, you can still give some autonomy. Like if you have to share your advice, like if it's something that you have to talk about, you never want to give a choice that's like a false choice and be like, well, sorry, we're going to do it anyway, because that feels terrible. But what you can do is say, all right, well, I can respect that you don't want to talk about it, but we really need to. So what would be a good time? We could do it now. We can do it later. What would work for you? And that at least gives some amount of autonomy with timing, even if with content they might not be able to choose. But that's the first step. Ask permission, then provide the information, and then follow up by asking them how they feel about it. And that literally can be just you saying, what do you think? Workable? And you can even say, like, it's okay to disagree. You can explicitly give permission to disagree with what you're saying. What happens then if you do that is that, assuming that they don't not like your advice because it's bad advice or something, they will have asked for your advice in the first place, like actively. They will have been said, like, yeah, okay, I'll hear what you have to say. They'll have asked for it. They will have heard it. And then out of their own mouth, they will have said that it's at least a decent idea. And what we know from research is that is far more effective in terms of someone taking that advice than you just saying it, when they're far more likely to just say whatever they think you want to hear, so you'll get out of their face and then they can go back to doing what they were doing before. So give that a shot. If you need to offer advice, do it in a feedback sandwich. The V in love stands for validating, which means, can you validate that underlying emotional need, even if you can't validate the behavior, which can be really tough to do sometimes when the behavior is concerning, right? We want to focus on, like, oh man, you vaped, or you did this, or you did that. But if we can take a second and try to understand their why and let them know that they are okay. They are an okay person. We love them, and the behavior is something that needs to change. That's a huge part of where emotional safety, particularly in these challenging moments, comes from. Can you validate that underlying emotion? That helps reinforce their self-efficacy and self-trust. And then lastly, empathizing. I'm going to borrow a phrase here from Brene Brown. If you haven't seen this video, go Google like Brene Brown empathy hole. But get in a hole with somebody. If they are in a deep, dark hole and they're feeling bad, what generally feels better is not someone like riding in on their white steed and like throwing them on and carrying them to safety. But generally people like to feel more is that you can come down in there with them and sit down in the hole and tell them that you get it. Maybe validate them and listen actively, and then offer that feedback sandwich about how they might be able to get out, maybe on their own, or maybe with your help. And that feels a lot more safe than those alternatives. So give that a shot. Listen actively, offer feedback sandwiches, validate the underlying emotion, and show some empathy. See how that works. If you don't have an emotionally safe relationship with your child right now, though, have persistence and try not to get discouraged. Changing someone's mind takes time, particularly if there's been years of maybe doing something different. So have persistence. Try not to get thrown too far of a loop. This does, in many cases, work. Or at the very least, this is the formula where emotional safety can come from. Sometimes you need some professional intervention or something, but this framework is very effective. So, all right, we're staying connected. We're knowing the signs of use. We're being safe to talk to. We are ideally promoting the development of coping behaviors, because again, if I take you back to that previous slide, one of the main reasons why kids are using substances is because they're trying to deal with something. They're trying to cope with the stress or internal or external stressors in their life. So giving them another way to do that is incredibly important. So things to think about for that, for their physical health, everything is harder if our bodies aren't right. You can probably all attest to this. I assume many of the folks here today are parents, so you know what it's like to have no sleep, because I think we all went through that experience when our kids were infants. Everything is tougher. Emotional regulation and modulation is tougher. Making sure kids are getting sleep. This also goes along with a bullet that's about to come up with screen time, and making sure that kids are not staying up to 11, midnight, 1, 2 a.m. With their phone or tablet, and then not sleeping, and then struggling during the day. But just making sure we've got good sleep, exercise, and nutrition. Screen time limits, again, I know is so because so much of kids' worlds right now are on screens, and there's actually a lot that you can do with that as well. If you got a question, like ask it in the Q&A, we can perhaps touch on that, how to help with that. But making sure that they're not just spending all their time behind a screen also matters a ton. If there was one skill that helps with coping that I would promote, it would be meditation and diaphragmatic breathing. It is so simple to do. You can actually, in 90 seconds, with diaphragmatic breathing, affect your physiology. So breathing in through your nose, down into your belly, out through your mouth. If you haven't heard of diaphragmatic breathing, highly encourage you. Look it up on YouTube. I think I actually have like a how-to on there on my channel, but it's so incredibly useful and effective. There's some apps that help kids learn meditation and deep breathing as well. A great way to work through moments of intense activation. Then, tried and true, talk through emotions and problems. This is huge, right? Leaning into the people who you care about and who you love, letting them be there for you. You ideally are there for them as well, but model that with your kids, right? Show them how to talk through those emotions and problems, help them through it. And then lastly, if you've got a kid who's really going down a negative road with vaping or with their emotional world, don't be afraid to talk to a therapist. I think sometimes parents think that like if you have to take your child to a therapist that like you failed as a parent or something, or it's like a referendum on you, and it's not. There's so many forces that act on your child that you can't control. But if you're looking at the trajectory of their mental health or their behavior and you're saying, like if this went in this direction for another 1 to 5 years, where would they be? And the answer to that question isn't doing pretty well. It's potentially worth talking to somebody who can help out with that. So a couple things to avoid. We're going to speed up just a little bit. I want to make sure we don't shortchange our Q&A, so got to make our way through the last couple slides here a little bit quicker. But some things to avoid. Make sure that you're not protecting your kids from earned consequences. The old term for this that might ring a bell is enabling, which isn't the best way to describe it. But essentially, if your child is acting in a way that should cause them some amount of discomfort, like a grounding or not being able to go somewhere or missing out on a trip or not having money for things or whatever it is, make sure that the negative consequences do occur and that you're not protecting your child from them, because what that ultimately does is it makes them not have that corrective feedback that might have them discontinue that behavior. Sometimes this happens because of avoidance and fear. Make sure just as a parent, you're checking yourself for that. Like, am I just avoiding my son or daughter because I feel like it'd be more trouble to do something about it? If that's the case, that's a big yellow or red flag, actually, that maybe it's time to take a step back and reassess how you're managing the situation. Parental splitting, where you're getting different messages from different people, is so challenging. I'd say one of the toughest challenges is if you have parents who are divorced or not getting along, or not living together, they're separated, and they're giving different messages to their child. It is so tough for any one part of that dyad to affect the child if there's different messages coming in from the other side. So ideally, you're unified if at all possible. But ultimately, the phrase I want to leave you with that I did not coin but really resonated with me when I heard it is, what you permit, you promote. So just let that sit for a second. What you permit, you promote. So if your child is continuing to vape and you're not necessarily taking any action towards that, if they are being actively disrespectful towards you on a regular basis and you don't do anything about it, that's saying do it again. That's saying keep this up, because they're doing it for a reason. All behavior has a purpose, right? So they're meeting their emotional needs by mouthing off or by vaping or whatever else, and they're learning that this is a way that works for them. And if that's not something that you want to reinforce, it's very important that you do something. Now, what you can do, one is you do have to have consistent boundaries and limits when a person is acting out. But, and this is a thing that I feel a lot of parents will move past, is they don't reward the behavior they want to see. They'll just punish the behavior they don't. And this is really critical, because the most powerful tool we have to shape human behavior is positive reinforcement, is giving a reward. That is why they vape in the first place, right? Because they're getting rewarded socially, they're getting rewarded chemically, perhaps they're getting a reward for doing it. So if the deal with working with you is that at best it's just neutral, and at worst there's a punishment, That's a tough sell, or at bare minimum, the only reason why they're doing it is because they're afraid of getting punished, which doesn't bode well for when they're out of the house and they're just going to turn right back around maybe and do the thing that was pleasurable to them, that they thought they were being rewarded for. So really making sure that you're thinking, how can I reinforce the behavior I want to see? What you permit, you promote, but also what you reward, you promote. Make sure to have access to phones and mobile devices, be on the same page again as your parenting partner, and take care of your marriage if you are in one, or your partnership if you're in one. As household leaders, you set the tone. So if your emotional health is suffering, or just the vibe in your house, the partnership that you have going on there is suffering, if again you're living with somebody, that flows down to the kids. So making sure that we're very aware of that. So pivoting for a second for those here from schools, what can schools do? Just 3 ideas here. First, make sure to educate and set accurate perceptions about vaping before environmental exposure. It is so much easier to give accurate information at the start than have to try to swim against the current, or try to say, well, what you've heard on Snapchat or Reddit or from your friends or wherever else is wrong, and here's what's right. Not that you can't provide that accurate information and break through, but it's a lot tougher. So if you are able to preemptively give kids the information they need that's accurate so that they can make informed decisions, that goes a long way. The second is create or cultivate youth-led prevention coalitions. So these are kids who are, it's a club at the high school in my area. It's actually very large. It's a large high school, about 4,500 kids, but there are 180 kids in the youth prevention coalition there. And they meet, I believe, once a week. They've got officers, they do political things. I mean, all sorts of things. But it's all about trying to keep their school off of substances. The messenger matters. And sometimes it matters far more if you're hearing it from another teen or from someone you respect who's your age than from someone like me or like you, if you're an adult. Third, help set accurate norms through messaging campaigns, because they tend to overestimate others' use rates. I can't tell you how many times I've been in schools where they'll say, like, oh, I feel like everyone's doing this. Everyone's doing this. The truth of the matter is that actually a vast majority of kids don't vape right now. There are some places, some pockets where there's a lot, but it's actually fairly low. It's not most, not even over half, not even over 2/3 at this point. So it's something where helping kids understand, just because you smell it when you go into the bathroom, just because your friends may be doing it, doesn't mean it's everybody. And helping kids understand what the actual use rates are, even at your own school, which can be very powerful data as well, can help a lot. Now, what communities can do about this, we can work on some policies. So access drives use, whether or not we're talking about alcohol, THC, nicotine, whatever it is. So reducing the number of retailers who are permitted to sell vaping products. If there's a way to do that, that helps a lot. Prohibit vaping, flavored vapes in your community. I cannot stress that enough. That is 90% of kids are using for the flavors. If the flavors are harder to get, if they're less available, fewer kids are going to use them. So can you create a bit more of a boundary or a buffer, which isn't to say, again, that someone couldn't order them online. There's ways to get around it, but what we do see are that the larger scale and larger geographic area bans tend to have a stronger positive effect on stopping kids from using than the smaller ones, or if there's no ban at all. You can also use behavioral economics and raise the price by applying a local tax. So you raise the price of something, fewer people tend to buy it. And that's another lever that we have at our disposal. Now, if you are a parent here and you have a teen who is using, and you're wondering, oh man, how do I help them quit? A few options for you. The first is if they need medication, talk to your pediatrician. There are actually some medications that a pediatrician can prescribe, can help with just the nicotine side of things and getting them off of it. If they're using because of an underlying behavioral health concern, or just even you like to work with a therapist who works with addiction to help them with this, I highly recommend using a therapy directory to find a therapist who's got the qualifications and takes the insurance that you're looking for. My favorite is Mental Health Match by Therapy Den. Psychology Today also will work, but it's absolutely massive. It's sometimes hard to find exactly what you want. And then lastly, a great free tool is through the Truth Initiative. They have created a text-based program to help kids quit vaping, and they recently published an article in a peer-reviewed journal showing that it is effective. It actually does help kids be more successful at quitting if they use this text-based program that helps them set a quit date, gives them motivational quotes, can kind of give them more information on demand, like they can text the number, get some support back. So this is a tool as well that you can pull on. Now, if you're looking for more information about this, there's national organizations that work on vaping in particular. The Truth Initiative does a tremendous amount of publication and research on this. I just mentioned them on the last slide, but other great groups, Parents Against Vaping, they've got a huge symposium every year with a bunch of great speakers, or online virtual one that you can go to. Reach Lab will talk about more in just a minute. Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. I Can End the Trend, and even just the Quit Now line for those 18 and older. So there is a lot of support because of how honestly destructive nicotine and tobacco can be from a public health lens. So don't be afraid to reach out there for support. I think, Michelle, am I pitching it back to you here, or shall I continue? Can't quite recall. I'll keep going just in case. What I want to talk a little bit more about the Reach Lab at Stanford. It's run by Dr. Bonnie Halpern-Felsher. She is absolutely fantastic, and they have created curricula to help teach kids about vaping and about other topics as well. They are really, really, really good, and they're actually all free, which is fantastic too. These are meant generally more for school environments, for like health classes over time, that sort of thing. But I think they've got a lot of different permutations. They've got infographics that you can download that you can use as well. And it's a highly evidence-based program. Again, I'm happy to endorse it myself. I think it's fantastic work. It's been used all over the country. And they actually have a conference coming up as well. This is a conference actually that I will be speaking at in a couple of months. I'll be talking about what we have data on in particular about engagement of THC products, but cannabis. Again, completely virtual, bunches of amazing speakers. I encourage you to check it out. Michelle, did you have a thought about that too?
Yeah, I was just going to say Dr. Weiner is presenting at the conference, and I am attending as a learner for that conference. And I've looked at the agenda. It is deep and strong. So I could encourage preventionalists on the call with us to check that out and see. It looked like it was running about $125. You can get CEU credit for it. And we just would like for you to just take a look at it, because it's just like today, keeps us current and gives us a lot of resources as parents on how to talk to our teens about the trends and things that are quickly changing all the time with vaping. It's a great time to submit your questions if you haven't already. We do have several in the queue, which we're excited to ask you about here in just a second, Dr. Weiner.
Yeah, well, I'll hop in again just to chat a little bit more about finding more of my resources if you're interested. So please feel free to drop me a line if you'd like. My email is aaron@weinerphd.com. So if you have questions we don't get to today, and again, we still got a good chunk of time for that, feel free to drop me a line. It's always like, oh, the webinar's over and I had a question. Just email me. Please find me on LinkedIn as well. I post on there very frequently. Pretty much everything you saw today in the presentation at one point was a LinkedIn post, because I'll read something and say, wow, that's super interesting and useful. And I'll put it on there and I'll stick it in a presentation. So please feel free to connect with me on there. I have a podcast called Let's Talk that you're also welcome to check out. My most recent episode, I was actually talking about smoking and vaping cessation with a gentleman who does work on that from a perspective of why do we treat smoking cessation differently than any other type of addiction, in terms of how it's reimbursed and treated, and should we be doing that? So interesting discussion on that front. I also have a blog on Psychology Today that I published too. There's one that I wrote a couple months back about the health differences between vaping and smoking. So if you'd like to break that open a little bit more, you can find that there. And then also if folks want to follow a little bit more of what I'm up to, I'm really happy to announce that I'm joining the executive team over at the Prevention Research Institute. So if you'd like to learn more about PRI, it's at primeforlife.org. And part of, honestly, what attracted me and brought me in there is that they've got a really great, succinct, clear way of helping empower people to make different choices around substances, specifically alcohol, a bit with THC. But you can see it in that chart over there, where essentially, if you boil it down, how do we understand our biology and our risk, and then what goes into the choices we make? And we have influence there in terms of the outcome. And we can even think about that in terms of the presentation today, right? No matter what biology a kid is coming into nicotine and vaping with, their choices are going to determine whether or not they develop a substance use disorder or an addiction to it. So if you want to find out more about what I'm going to be up to in the future, really excited to join the team over there. Feel free to reach out to me or head over to primeforlife.org to learn more.
We're excited for you about that opportunity and to know that that's coming next for you. That's a really cool organization. Congratulations.
Thank you. Oh, and I'll kick us off talking about the handbook. So I'll let Michelle talk more about the specifics with the handbook because she probably wrote a bunch of it herself. But I will say they're awesome. I've gotten previous versions. I think I have these as well. They are super useful. The graphic design, as you can see from here as well, is super pretty, easy to look at, great to use. So I'll pass it over to Michelle to tell you a little bit more about it. But I'm happy to endorse these handbooks. They're a really great resource.
Thank you for that vote of confidence, for sure. Our handbooks are very regularly updated, super current, and we have middle and high as well as elementary versions, Spanish and Christian. And so we've got a wide variety of ways for you to get information about the tough topics that our teens are facing today. We went deep on vaping, and there's a vaping chapter in each of our handbooks. I invite you to grab one. Obviously, Dr. Weiner, you're showing us the need to keep up on vaping and to protect the relationship with our teens. Our handbooks are an affordable, easy resource for parents to do just that. And so I really encourage you to make a decision today to get one of these handbooks on your shelf or purchase a sample for your school, your organization, your church. You will not be sorry. You can also see, if you're an organization who might like to share this with a lot of parents, that there is bulk pricing available. You can go to Operation Parent /shop to learn more. Another product I'm super excited to tell you about is our TNT Trends and Training. This is drug education event in a kit. Everything is included. So all of the drug fact posters, the t-shirts, the banners, how to advertise the event. But most importantly, what you're teaching your community is how to say no to today's substances. And we know we need more of that. So we put together this product to help you with that. We were fortunate enough to host an event in the fall where we had 400 attendees from all the middle schools in our area come join us on a Saturday afternoon and work through this program. And it was fun, vibrant, amazing. Our youth did not even realize how much they were learning. And they were having so much fun as they were doing it. But then we had a wrap-up conversation at the end where you saw that it did all sink in on a very deep way. And so if you'd like to know more about our handbooks or this powerful TNT Trends and Training, you can use the pop-up here and just indicate that you're interested in our products, and our wonderful community advocates will be willing to tell you more about how folks all across the country in every state are using our products to make a difference with prevention. I hope you'll follow us on our vibrant social media channels. We are at Operation Parent on all of our platforms, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We are toggling Dr. Weiner and keeping up there on LinkedIn and growing a presence, as well as Instagram and Facebook. So we invite you to join us there. There are tips that you can learn as a parent, or if you're a preventionalist, you can share the tips with your community, as well as just really great content and a very vibrant community. People are sharing with us how they're using Operation Parent in their community, and it's really amazing to watch it grow. If you didn't get a chance at the beginning of the webinar, now's your opportunity to use the quick registration for the upcoming webinars. I can tell from the conversations in the Q&A and the chat that you all are using and learning a lot today. So I hope you'll keep joining us all the way through the next 3 webinars. That would be amazing. All right, Dr. Weiner, thank you for your wide, deep presentation and how many resources you gave us as parents. Really appreciate all the work that you put in and how current your presentation was. Thank you so much. Okay, so I got to tell you.
Laura Stack is amazing, so definitely sign up for that. Not that the other presenters aren't, I just know Laura very well, and I think that's going to be an absolute.
That's right. We've been, thank you for that. We've been lucky to work together on several occasions, so we kind of have we got our groove going, don't we? Okay, so I noticed there was a very strong reaction from the audience when you showed the vapes that look like games. And one of our participants asked, what can parents do about this? And then another parent asked, where are they being sold?
Well, so here's what I would say about that, because it's a complicated answer. The second one is not complicated. They're being sold pretty much anywhere, although very much online. You can buy them online and have them shipped. And again, if you just Google it, it'll pop right up and you can see where to buy it. They're very easy to get. I think ultimately what this comes back to has to do with laws, regulation, and enforcement. And what I would say is it's always I was actually just recently at a conference in Washington, D.C., and I went to about 4 different offices of senators and reps, and they listen. Like you call them, they've got interns, they're answering the phone, they're taking down your opinion, they're patting it into the pile. If this is something you care about and you want to say like, hey, why in the world are we allowing them to put games in vape devices? We have to change this. This is where the critical mass comes from, is actually having a broad scale change where we make policy changes that stop this from happening, and then also really make it clear that enforcement around that is a priority. If they wanted to shut down, I'm forgetting the name of the brand that publicly creates the like Tamagotchi vapes, they could shut them down, and that might be useful, but someone else could make it then, right? Like I think that we've really got to think about some broad scale change and how we go about doing this. But this is one of those things where we really need the government. So I would encourage you to leverage your voice.
Absolutely, and I think for me, what I'm noting in our community and with Parents Against Vaping, the organization that you mentioned, our youth are, I'm so excited about our future, and I have a lot of faith in our future based on what youth are doing today. And I know one of the things that really speaks to them is wrapping around a cause. And so one of the causes that you could get youth's attention on is that environmental component that you spoke about. Like that, what the disposable vapes with the batteries are doing to the environment, and getting youth, to speak up about that part and the other parts of vaping that they don't care for or whatnot.
Yeah, like meet them where they're at, right? Like it's tough to get someone to care about something they don't care about, but if you know there's an issue, and this is where a local view matters a lot. Like if you know that there's something that people in the high school care about, the kids in the high school care about, lean into that, make it relevant to them.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you feel like is the right age to talk to youth about vaping? And then also, once you cover that a little bit, what age is really like too young to intro vaping prevention and what the vapes look like?
Yeah. Also, I think like so many things, right? You have to tailor sometimes how you speak about a subject to different age groups because they might not get it quite as much when they're younger. Like My son, for example, I've got a son and a daughter. My son is 8. He knows what I do, because this is what daddy does, right? And so we talk a little about like what is addiction? What are these substances? Why do people fall into the trap? And so he gets it at kind of like a high level. When though that I would say, getting back to that theme of how do we preempt messaging and coming across it in the wild and getting opinions from people who are say trying to rationalize their own behavior by giving misinformation out. I think you've got to go probably if I had to give an ideal age, I'd probably say somewhere around like the 11 years old range, maybe even going down to 10 in some cases. We're not seeing as much vaping before 7th grade. But starting in 7th grade is where we really start to see it creep up a bit. And then certainly once we get to high school is where, there's so much mixing where we see a lot more of it. So I would say that if you were having just a more open conversation about it, letting kids know about they might run into this, so you can have that conversation at or before 7th grade. I think that's a pretty good time to get specific.
That's so good. And if they start to know your general family code about we avoid substances, all substances, that might help them start to maybe ask you some questions about things if they're seeing it at a younger age. Okay, let's see, where do we go next? How about what do you say to youth who might say that pouches are better because they don't have the chemicals of vapes?
Yeah. So if I was hearing someone say that to me, I think I would try to go up a level and say, well, so what's the point in using this, right? And try to get at the why. What are they trying to achieve? And then also get back at the point where, better than maybe, maybe it doesn't have chemicals in the lungs, but it affects your brain. And it's demonstrated to do that. I think where I always go with kids, is I don't tell them what to do. I think that that's a great way to get pushback. Instead, I really try to be clear about the information, about like what they need to know to make an informed decision, and be like, listen, here's what this is going to do to your brain. Like, here's what the statistics say. Here's what medicine says. You have to decide if this is worth it, because adults, we're not going to be there when kids are making a decision to do this or not. Probably not when they're under 18, certainly not when they're over. They've got to make those decisions for their own reasons on their own. And so I think that getting that started, certainly, as a parent, you've got to have boundaries, have expectations for your child's behavior. There's those elements as well. But in terms of changing somebody's mind, I think particularly in this day and age, showing someone the respect of saying, okay, here's all the information. You make the call. Like, is this worth it to you, given what it could do to you in ways that may not ever go away? It really is. You've got to make that call. I find that's a tack that tends to work pretty well.
I love that. So good.
Yeah.
What would you say are the biggest misconceptions that you hear when you're talking directly with teens about vaping?
I would say the biggest misconceptions are that there's no toxin that's not harmful. I think, again, the word vape was very carefully chosen because it sounds like water vapor, and it sounds harmless, and it sounds just fine. I think that they don't necessarily understand the implications. I think actually, and this is going to be stepping on Laura's toes next month a little bit, I think the misinformation is even stronger for THC and marijuana products right now than it is for nicotine. I think that there's a lot of kids who are starting to understand that there's some toxins in there that's starting to permeate a bit, which is part of why in some ways we're seeing that slightly lower rate at high school than we are at college, because I think that there's just a lot more social pressure there, and maybe a little bit more of that invulnerability complex than even what you see in high school. But but I think ultimately like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know how you went over the signs with us to know that your teen might be vaping? Would you add anything different there if the teen is utilizing THC in a vape? Is there anything that would come out differently with that?
Yeah, well, there were actually a couple little points in there that I accidentally left in there from THC, with like the red eyes, for example. Dilated eyes can be a sign that they're using concentrates, which is what they're most oftentimes vaping. But beyond that, there's an intoxicating element to THC that's not there for nicotine. So nicotine is a stimulant, and so they might be like a little bit more edgy, they might be a little bit more jumpy, but we're not going to see lethargy. We're not going to see an altered state of consciousness. We're not going to see any of those sorts of things. So I would look for that. There's also going to be perhaps a period of time that they might be avoiding you, so that they try to hide the fact that they're high, and they don't
Good
want you
point.
to,
Yep.
so like there may be that's the part that I'd add on in particular to watch for. It's also going to have much more of a direct interference with things like schoolwork. Certainly if someone's like out vaping and not studying, that's going to impact schoolwork regardless of the substance. But again, if you're high, which will last for several hours, like 4 to 6, depending on how strong of a product they're using, that's going to take an even bigger chunk out of your day. So
can you please give encouragement to parents who are helping teens quit, and talk about how hard quitting vapes are for teens?
Yeah. Well, so if it's giving encouragement to the parents, I'm happy to say thank you for what you're doing. It is really, really important. And I think truly the declining teen use rate is evidence of all the work that's going into it. It is really tough to do it though, because it's this complicated web, right? Where you've got the biological draw, you've got the social pressures, and even just the habituation, right? Where people are using it so often and so often and so often. So any amount of tools you're providing, whether or not you're talking with them, whether or not you're connecting them with therapy, a pediatrician, really trying to create an environment, a supportive environment for success. Thank you for what you do. And if the question had more to do with how do you support kids, I think it would be, again, just to really help them keep their eye on their why. Why do you want to quit? What's the purpose behind this? Really keep that firmly in mind, because it is tough. It's very tough. And helping them bounce back from moments, if they say have a slip, and and really just keep them anchored in who they want to be rather than where they are right now, that goes a long, long way.
Yeah, awesome advice. It's so strong. The nicotine is so strong, and it's so quickly addicting. And so for those parents who are working on the quitting thing, we're here to support you on that, and keep going. Like you said, remembering the why, but also helping them with their daily routines that they've gotten into with vaping, like helping them change up their routines a little bit, to not have the trigger for the vape thing. Okay, how about, so someone in the audience made a great point that the nicotine pouch products, over 20 of them, have been given FDA approval as of January 16th, 2025. So is that what you're hearing as well and have seen?
Yeah, well, so this actually is a really interesting point. They are following the rules in that regard. So almost every flavored vape you see is actually being sold illegally, just straight up. There's just almost no enforcement around it. With the nicotine pouches, they are actually going through the proper authorization channels and showing that you can use these pouches to stop smoking. Again, there's a big difference, though, between stopping smoking and stopping nicotine. And there's a big difference between no nicotine in the growing adolescent brain and putting it in there, regardless of the delivery method. And so that's part of why we are going to see probably more of this in the future. It might even be a lot more prevalent than vaping if we can finally get our authorities to properly get these illegal vapes out of stores and offline, as they should. But again, what's important to recognize about going through that authorization process is just simply saying that they do not have the same contaminants. There's a process through which that they are being created, but also that they do what they say they do to help somebody stop smoking. That does not mean that they're safe for kids. That does not mean that they're harmless. That just means that they do what they say they do, in terms of if someone is trying to stop smoking, they can use the pouches to get there.
Outstanding. So Dr. Weiner, I know that you are not a fan of scare tactics to get teens' attention. We certainly are not here at Operation Parent. What do you lean on right now? As I know you're reading and digesting a lot of evidence-based material and things. But if you just have a teen at your practice in your office and you're helping them with their plan, what do you share with them about the research and maybe how long it is even going to take for vaping research to catch up to what's actually happening to our youth? But what are some of the things that you say to youth and to professionals in prevention that are not scare tactic based?
So the tried and true method of motivating behavior is connecting them with values. And that's always where I start. What do people want? How do they want to act? What do they want to embody with their behaviors? What matters to them? And then you can start to do something called develop discrepancy, where you start to have someone say, okay, so now how does vaping map onto that? Is this in line with where I want to go and the sort of person I want to be? Or does it seem like it's maybe pulling me away from my values, pulling me away from my goals? A lot of times then you can use the evidence to help them see, is it pulling me away or not? The scary tactic element of it is challenging sometimes, because the truth of the matter is, like, there's elevated levels of uranium and lead in your urine if you're vaping a lot. I don't know, to me that's kind of scary. It's also true, right? And so I think that it's one of those things where people deserve to know. And I think that the way you frame that information matters a lot. If I were a kid and I were vaping, I would want to know that I'm probably putting uranium and lead into my body. Now, if you're framing that as like, be scared, stop now, that feels a lot different than someone saying like, hey, you should know all this stuff so that you can make an informed choice. And then also, what do you want? Like, do you care about the health of your body? Do you care about the development of your brain? Do you care about these particular things? And if you do, here's some information that might help you make an informed decision. What you actually do is up to you. That's how I tend to work with it. I don't think we should censor ourselves from giving kids really important health-related information just because it's scary. I think that's just like with fentanyl, right? Like, fentanyl is out there. It's a really bad time to be using street drugs. We should be talking about that, even if it's scary, because it's true and it's killing people. So I think the same thing is true with vaping. Kids deserve to know, but I think the way that you present it and showing them the respect of saying like, hey, you need to make your own decisions, I think that's the most important part.
Yeah, that's the way to go. And it feels like a perfect spot for us to wrap up on, just being in line with the values, and then also just being passionate about protecting the youth and getting the information to them in a way that really resonates. Our we only get one chance at our health, and we always want better for our kids than the life that we've had. So any resource that you give us, any opportunity to talk about that and get ourselves more confident to be able to talk to our teens about it, we're going to take it. And so we appreciate everything that you've done, and just finishing us up on like such a powerful note. We sure appreciate your time, and we look forward to hearing about your future adventures. And what we wanted to say to parents is, you've got this, parents, and we here at Operation Parent and Dr. Weiner, we've got you to help. We're here to help you, and I hope that everybody has a great rest of the day, and we'll see you on our next webinar.
Take care, everybody. Appreciate you
Take
staying.
care.